Howard Mitchell lived alone in his small house at the edge of Millbrook Valley. Every morning for 15 years, he followed the same routine: coffee at 7, crossword puzzle at 8, and a walk around his garden at 9. That's how it had been since he lost everything, and that's how he thought it would always be. Until one rainy morning, when an old golden retriever showed up on his porch. The dog was wet, shivering, and had no collar. Howard didn't usually let anyone or anything disturb his careful routine, but something in the dog's gentle brown eyes made him open his door. What he didn't know was that this dog belonged to someone from his past, someone he'd never stopped loving. Could a lost dog really bring two hearts back together after 40 years apart? The leather-bound planner on Howard's desk hadn't changed in 15 years. Each page was divided into precise half-hour increments, filled with the same activities written in his steady hand. 7 to rise a.m., coffee, morning news. 7:30 a.m., breakfast. 2 eggs, toast. 8 a.m., crossword puzzle. The pages for the next month looked identical to those from the previous year, and the year before that. This was how Howard Mitchell had rebuilt his life after everything fell apart, one carefully scheduled moment at a time. But now, a wet nose pressed against his leg as he tried to focus on 6 across in today's puzzle. The golden retriever sat patiently beside his chair, those soulful brown eyes fixed on him with an expression that seemed to say, "I'm here now. Things can be different." Howard glanced at his planner. 8:15 a.m. Nothing about feeding a stray dog. Nothing about paper towels to dry rain-soaked fur. Nothing about the strange ache in his chest when those eyes met his. "Just until the rain stops," he said aloud, though no one had asked how long the dog could stay. His voice sounded strange in the quiet house. He'd gotten used to whole days, passing without speaking a word. The dog's tail thumped against the hardwood floor. 15 years ago, Howard had arrived in Millbrook Valley with nothing but a suitcase and a determination to disappear. The small house at the edge of town, with its overgrown garden and peeling paint, had suited his purposes perfectly. No neighbors dropping by with casseroles, no invitations to town events, no well-meaning attempts to draw him out of his shell. Just quiet, predictable solitude. He'd spent that first year restoring order to the chaos, pruning back the wild. Roses, scraping and repainting the clapboards, establishing his routines. The garden gate, hanging crooked on rusted hinges, had been his first repair project. Now it stood straight and true, its white paint pristine, marking the boundary between his orderly world and the messiness of everything beyond. The dog had somehow pushed through that gate this morning, leaving a muddy smudge on the paint. Howard had noticed it immediately. He noticed every imperfection in his carefully maintained environment, but instead of feeling the usual flash of irritation at disorder, he'd felt something else, something that reminded him of earlier days, when life was less predictable, but somehow more alive. Standing at his kitchen counter now, Howard found himself breaking another routine. Instead of his usual measured portion of coffee beans, he ground extra. Instead of his carefully planned breakfast, he scrambled a 3rd egg and shared it with his unexpected guest. The dog ate politely, then licked the plate clean with thorough enthusiasm. "You've had training," Howard observed, noting the dog's mannerly behavior. "Someone's missing you." The thought brought an unexpected pang. Already, after just a few hours, the house felt less empty. He checked his watch. 9 a.m., time for his garden walk. The rain had stopped, sunlight breaking through the clouds to sparkle on wet leaves. The dog followed him outside, keeping perfect pace as Howard made his usual circuit of the flower beds. The roses needed deadheading. Howard reached for his pruning shears, then paused, watching as the dog sniffed around the base of a climbing vine. For 15 years, he'd tended this garden with scientific precision, each plant catalogued and maintained according to strict schedules. But now, seeing it through his companion's curious exploration, it seemed different, less like a project to be managed, more like a living thing to be discovered. A scattered pile of leaves caught his eye, evidence of the dog's earlier passage through the gate. His usual impulse would be to rake them immediately, maintaining the garden's pristine order. Instead, Howard found himself sinking onto the wooden bench beside the rose arbor, patting the space next to him. The dog jumped up immediately, settling against his leg with a contented sigh. "You're disrupting everything," Howard told him, but his voice held no reproach. The morning sun was warm on his face, the roses were heavy with raindrops, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Howard Mitchell sat in his garden, without counting the minutes until his next scheduled task. When he finally stood to go inside, the dog followed without hesitation, as if they'd been doing this dance for years instead of hours. Howard paused at the door, looking back at his garden. The muddy paw prints on the path, the scattered leaves, the slight disorder. It all seemed less like violations of his careful routine and more like signs of life returning to a place that had been too perfect, too sterile, for too long. Inside, Howard opened his planner to today's page. After a moment's consideration, he picked up his pen and carefully added a new entry. 10:30 a.m., feed dog. Then, below it, 2 p.m., walk dog? The question mark felt foreign in his precise schedule, but somehow right. The dog, as if reading over his shoulder, gave a soft woof of approval. Dr. Sarah Chen's veterinary clinic occupied a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, its wraparound porch now serving as a waiting area for pets and their owners. Howard hesitated at the bottom of the steps, one hand gripping the makeshift leash he'd fashioned from old gardening twine. The golden retriever waited patiently beside him, apparently unbothered by their improvised arrangement. "Mitchell?" A woman emerging from her SUV did a double-take. "Howard Mitchell?" He nodded, stiffly, recognizing Margaret Dawson, who'd been running the hardware store since before he moved to town. In 15 years, their interactions had never extended beyond brief transactions over paint supplies and garden tools. "Never thought I'd see you here," she said, then noticed the dog. "Well, that's new. Found him this morning," Howard explained, surprised to find himself volunteering information. "No collar. Thought I should have him checked for a microchip." The dog chose that moment to lean affectionately against Howard's leg, and Margaret's expression softened. "About time something brought you out of that house. Sarah's the best vet in 3 counties. She'll help you sort things out." Inside, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and pet shampoo. A cat in a carrier meowed plaintively, and a young mother struggled to contain an enthusiastic puppy. Howard found himself cataloguing the differences between this scene and his memories of veterinary offices from before everything changed, before he'd locked himself away from the world. "Your name?" The receptionist's greeting interrupted his thoughts. "Howard Mitchell. The dog's not mine. He showed up this morning." She nodded, typing into her computer. "Dr. Chen can see you in about 15 minutes. We'll need to fill out some paperwork." Howard accepted the clipboard she offered, noting with mild discomfort how the familiar act of filling out forms somehow made this situation more real. Name, address, phone number, each field a reminder that he was stepping outside the careful boundaries he'd drawn around his life. The dog sat quietly at his feet as he wrote, occasionally glancing up as if to check that Howard was still there. Something about that trusting gaze made Howard's chest tighten. "Mr. Mitchell?" Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, younger than he'd expected, with kind eyes behind stylish glasses. "Come on back." The examination room was small but efficient, with posters of canine anatomy on the walls and a substantial metal table in the center. The dog needed no coaxing to hop up when Dr. Chen patted the surface. "He's in excellent condition," she noted, running practiced hands over his coat. "Senior, but well cared for. Let's check for that microchip." Howard watched as she ran a handheld scanner over the dog's shoulders. After a moment, it beeped. "Good news, he is chipped." Dr. Chen frowned slightly at her screen. But the registration is outdated. Last owner's information is from 2018. Lisa Thompson in Cincinnati. Thompson. The name hit Howard like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. It couldn't be related. Thompson was a common name and Cincinnati was hours away. I can put his information into our lost pet database, Dr. Chen continued, and you should file a report with the police. They keep records of lost pet reports. Does he— Howard cleared his throat. Does his record show his name? Dr. Chen smiled. Yes. He's registered as Max. About 10 years old now. Max. The name suited him somehow. The dog, Max, thumped his tail at the sound of it. He seems quite taken with you, Dr. Chen observed. Would you be willing to foster him while we search for his owner? The shelter's pretty full right now. Howard hadn't planned for this. His carefully ordered life didn't have room for a dog, especially not a senior dog who might have health issues or special needs. He had routines, schedules, a system that worked precisely because it never changed. Max looked at him with those gentle brown eyes. Yes, Howard heard himself say, I can do that. Dr. Chen's smile widened. Wonderful. Let me get you some basic supplies, food recommendations, a proper leash. Do you have experience with dogs? A long time ago, Howard said quietly. Before the accident, before everything fell apart. As Dr. Chen gathered supplies and information, Howard found himself remembering another dog, a black lab named Scout, who'd been part of that earlier life, who'd been in the car that day, who hadn't made it. Max pressed his head against Howard's hand as if sensing his dark thoughts. The warm weight of him was anchoring, present, alive. Here's my card, Dr. Chen said, returning with a bag of supplies. And call if you need anything. And Mr. Mitchell, thank you for helping him. Outside, the morning had warmed considerably. Howard looked down at Max, now properly leashed, with a bright blue collar, from Dr. Chen's supply of donated items. Well, I suppose we should stop by the police station next. Max wagged his tail agreeably. For the first time in 15 years, Howard Mitchell turned left at the end of Maple Street instead of right, walking deeper into town instead of retreating to his sanctuary at its edge. Each step felt like crossing an invisible boundary, like pushing through his own garden gate. He told himself it was just temporary, just until they found Max's owner, just a small deviation from his carefully planned life. But somewhere deep, inside, in a place he'd locked away long ago, Howard felt something shift, like a rusty hinge beginning to move, like a door, long closed, starting to open. Max's tennis ball rolled under the credenza, coming to rest against a stack of boxes Howard hadn't touched in years. He got down on his hands and knees, reaching for the ball, when his fingers brushed against something else. A book, its spine thick with dust. Look what you've done now, he muttered to Max, but there was no real reproach in his voice. The dog watched with interest as Howard pulled out the volume. Millbrook High School, class of 1973. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the yearbook. The pages fell open naturally to a well-worn section. Senior class, TZ. There she was. Claire Thompson, her smile as bright as he remembered, dark hair falling past her shoulders in the style of the time. Below her photo was a list of activities: drama club, yearbook committee, garden club president, and a quote, "The best is yet to come." Howard ran his finger over the image, remembering how they'd laughed when choosing their senior quotes. He'd picked something forgettable about success, but Claire had insisted on optimism. Because it's true, she'd said. The best really is yet to come. They'd believed that then. Young and in love, with college acceptances in hand and a whole future stretching out before them. Howard flipped to his own photo, barely recognizing the confident young man grinning back at him. No hint in that face of what lay ahead, the accident, the loss, the years of solitude. Max nudged his arm, bringing him back to the present. The tennis ball lay forgotten under the credenza as Howard settled into his armchair, the yearbook open on his lap. Max sat beside him, head resting on his knee. "You would have liked Claire," Howard told him, turning to the activities section. There she was again, kneeling in the school garden she'd helped create. Howard was in the background of that photo, not officially part of the garden club, but always finding reasons to be around while Claire worked. The memory hit him with unexpected force. The scent of fresh earth and spring flowers, Claire's laugh as she taught him the difference between perennials and annuals, the way the sunlight caught in her hair. They'd spent countless afternoons in that garden, planning their future between pruning roses and planting bulbs. "We were going to have a garden like that," he told Max, who listened with apparent interest. "A big one, with a greenhouse for winter." Claire knew everything about plants, which ones needed full sun, which ones could tolerate shade. She could make anything grow. He turned another page and found himself staring at the spring formal photos. There they were, Claire in a pale blue dress, Howard in a rented tuxedo with a slightly crooked bow tie. They looked impossibly young, impossibly happy. Someone had caught them mid-laugh, Claire's head thrown back, Howard looking at her like she was the only person in the world. "She fixed my tie right after this," he remembered aloud, "said I couldn't go through life with crooked bow ties, not that I've worn one since." His voice trailed off as another photo caught his eye. The drama club's production of Our Town. Claire had played Emily, radiant in her character's wedding scene. Howard had helped build the sets just to be near her during rehearsals. The night of the performance, watching her on stage, he'd been so certain they'd have their own wedding someday. Max whined softly, pressing closer to Howard's side. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, and Howard realized he'd missed several items in his daily schedule. The old Howard would have been anxious about such disruption, but somehow, sitting here with Max and these memories, the schedule didn't seem quite so important. He closed the yearbook gently, but didn't return it to its dusty hiding place. Instead, he set it on the coffee table, where the afternoon sun caught its gold lettering. "The best is yet to come." "What do you think, Max?" he asked. "Think there's any truth to that after all these years?" Max's tail thumped against the floor, and Howard found himself smiling. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. The kind he hadn't used much in the past 15 years. Standing, he stretched his stiff muscles and checked his watch. Nearly dinner time, for both of them now. "Come on, boy. Let's see what Dr. Chen packed in that bag of supplies." As he measured out dog food and prepared his own simple meal, Howard kept glancing at the yearbook. It was strange how the past could lie dormant for so long, then suddenly spring back to life with the turn of a page. Strange how a random act, a lost dog, a displaced tennis ball, could shift the foundations of a carefully constructed solitude. Max ate his dinner with characteristic politeness, then settled into what had already become his spot beside Howard's chair. Together, they watched the sunset paint the garden in shades of gold, while the yearbook sat on the coffee table like a door waiting to be opened, a story waiting to be continued. Rose's diner hadn't changed in 40 years. The same red vinyl booths lined the windows, their surfaces worn smooth by countless customers. The same chrome-edged counter stretched along one wall, topped with glass-covered cake stands. Even the menu, laminated and slightly dog-eared, listed the same comfort foods it had served since Howard was in high school. "Well, I'll be damned." Rose herself stood behind the counter, her hair now silver but her eyes as sharp as ever. "Howard Mitchell, thought you'd forgotten where we were." Howard shifted the stack of found dog posters under his arm, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Hello, Rose." "Sit," she commanded, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Still take it black?" He hesitated, but the morning crowd had thinned, leaving only a few regulars scattered among the booths. Less chance of extended social interaction. "Yes, thank you." The coffee came in a thick white mug, the kind that had always reminded him of Sunday mornings with his parents. Rose set it down with practiced efficiency, then planted both hands on the counter. "So, heard you found yourself a dog." News traveled fast in Millbrook Valley. It always had. Temporarily, Howard clarified, pulling out one of the posters he'd made. The photo showed Max sitting proudly in the garden, his golden coat glowing in the morning sun. Just until we find his owner. Rose studied the picture. Handsome fellow. Looks right at home in your garden. She paused, something softening in her expression. Claire's roses still blooming? Howard's hand tightened on his coffee mug. Of course Rose would remember. She'd been here that spring of '73, watching their romance unfold over shared milkshakes and French fries. Different roses now, he managed. Had to replant everything when I moved in. Rose nodded, but her eyes held knowing sympathy. Mind if I put one of these by the register? Lot of people come through here? Please. Howard slid several posters across the counter, then reached for his wallet. Coffee's on the house, Rose said firmly, but you might want to try the pie. Made it fresh this morning. Apple crumble. Before Howard could decline, she was all ready, cutting a slice. The scent of cinnamon and butter wafted across the counter, startlingly familiar. Saturdays after football games, he and Claire would split a piece, fighting playfully over the crumb topping. You know, Rose continued, sliding the plate toward him, Claire always said you were the only one who understood why the crumble was the best part. Howard's fork clattered against the plate. Claire! Mm-hmm. Rose busied herself wiping down the already clean counter. She was in here last week. Just passing through, she said, but ordered her usual turkey club, extra pickles. The diner suddenly felt too small, too close. Claire had sat at this counter, maybe in this very spot, just days ago. Had she looked at the garden through the window? Had she thought about those Saturday afternoons, those shared slices of pie? Looks different, Rose commented, following his gaze to the garden. Used to be all wildflowers out there. Now it's all... She waved a hand. Organized. Everything has its place, Howard said automatically, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. Rose's snort was decidedly unimpressed. Life's not a garden, Howard. Can't control where everything grows. The bell above the door chimed, and a group of customers entered. Rose straightened, reaching for her order pad. Think about what I said, and take another slice of pie for the road. Dog might like a treat. Howard found himself walking home with a paper bag containing a generous slice of apple crumble and, mysteriously, a turkey club sandwich with extra pickles. The found dog posters were now displayed in various shop windows along Main Street, each interaction having been less painful than he'd expected. Max greeted him at the gate, tail wagging. Howard looked at his garden, neat rows, carefully spaced plantings, everything in its designated spot. When had order become more important than beauty? Come on, he told Max, holding up the paper bag. Let's have lunch in the garden. Maybe... He hesitated, then continued, maybe we could let a few things grow wild. Max's enthusiastic response seemed like agreement. Together they settled on the bench, sharing turkey and pie, while the spring breeze ruffled the two neat flower beds, carrying the promise of change on the wind. Claire Thompson stood in her sister's guest bedroom, surrounded by moving boxes, labeled in her precise handwriting, kitchen, books, photos. But it was the unmarked box in the corner that drew her attention, the one she'd carried in her car rather than trusting to the movers, the one containing pieces of a life she'd left behind in Millbrook Valley 4 decades ago. Max, she called, then remembered. The house felt emptier without the click of his paws on the hardwood floors. 3 days since he'd slipped through the garden gate, spooked by a passing truck during their morning walk. 3 days of putting up posters, calling shelters, driving through unfamiliar streets in a town that somehow felt both strange and achingly familiar. Still no word. Her sister Rachel appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. Nothing yet. Claire's hand brushed the edge of the unmarked box. I should never have brought him here. He's too old for such a big change. You couldn't exactly leave him behind, Rachel pointed out. Not after Robert. The sentence hung unfinished, but Claire felt its weight. After Robert's death, after 35 years of marriage, after the quiet house in Cincinnati became too full of absence, Max had been her anchor. Now he too was gone. With careful movements that betrayed her reluctance, Claire opened the unmarked box. On top lay a faded blue ribbon, Garden Club, first prize, spring 1973. Beneath it, wrapped in tissue paper, a pressed rose, its color long faded but its form still perfect. And there, at the bottom, a stack of letters tied with a fraying ribbon. "I wondered if you'd kept those," Rachel said softly. "I kept everything." Claire lifted out the bundle of letters. Howard's handwriting filled each envelope, strong and sure, full of plans and promises. The last one was unopened, arriving after everything changed. "You know," Rachel ventured, "I saw him once, about 10 years ago, at the hardware store. He's still here." "I know." Claire's fingers traced the edge of the unopened letter. "Rose told me, when I stopped at the diner last week. Said he lives at the edge of town, has a garden." "Of course he has a garden." Rachel's smile was gentle. "You two and your gardens. Remember how you used to say you could tell everything about a person by how they tended their plants?" Claire did remember. She remembered teaching Howard about companion planting, about the language of flowers, about letting beauty find its own path. She remembered his earnest attention, the way he'd absorbed every detail, the plans they'd made for their own garden someday. "Rose says it's very organized now," she said quietly. "Everything in straight lines. No wild cards. People change." "Yes." Claire set the letters aside and pulled out a photograph, the old school garden in full bloom, herself kneeling among the flowers, Howard's familiar figure in the background. "Yes, they do." A car door slammed outside, and Claire started, half expecting, to hear Max's welcoming bark. The silence that followed felt wrong, out of balance, like a garden missing its centerpiece. "You could go see him," Rachel suggested. "Howard. Maybe he's heard something about Max." Claire shook her head. "It's been 40 years, Rachel. What would I even say?" "The truth. That you're back. That you're looking for your dog. That you're sorry about—" "Don't." Claire carefully rewrapped the pressed rose. Some things are better left in the past. Like pressed flowers, beautiful to remember, but they fall apart if you try to touch them." Rachel watched as her sister methodically repacked the box. Each item returned to its place. "You know what Mom used to say about gardens? Sometimes the most beautiful blooms come from seeds that lay dormant for years, just waiting for the right moment to grow." "Mom said a lot of things about gardens," Claire smiled faintly. "She's the one who taught me that you can't control where wildflowers decide to bloom." A sudden breeze through the open window scattered some of Claire's paperwork. As she gathered the fallen sheets, a lost dog poster caught her eye, her own handiwork, showing Max's gentle face, those wise brown eyes that had helped her through the lonely months after Robert's passing. "He'll turn up," Rachel assured her. "Max is smart. He'll find his way to someone who'll help him get home." Home. Claire looked around the guest room, at the boxes waiting to be unpacked, at the unmarked one holding pieces of her past. After 40 years, she was back in Millbrook Valley, back where she'd first learned about love and loss, about gardens and growth, about plans that bloomed and plans that withered. She just wasn't sure anymore where home was supposed to be. The Millbrook Valley Gazette hadn't changed much since 1973. Still published weekly, still printed on the same presses, still featuring Marie Henderson's gossipy around-town column on page 2. But today's edition carried something that made several longtime residents pause over their morning coffee. Under Lost and Found, between ads for a used lawnmower and piano lessons, sat 2 notices side by side. Found. Senior male golden retriever, well-trained, no collar. Contact Howard Mitchell. Lost. Beloved golden retriever, answers to Max. Gentle senior dog, greatly missed. Contact Claire Thompson. At the Sweet Bean Cafe, Marie Henderson herself was holding court. The newspaper spread before her. "Did you see this?" she asked anyone who would listen. Howard Mitchell and Claire Thompson, both in the paper after all these years, and neither one knows about the other's notice. Behind the counter, Jenny Chen, Dr. Chen's younger sister, tried to focus on making lattes while her mother, Linda, reminisced with Marie about the old days. "Such a tragedy," Linda said, shaking her head. "That factory accident changed everything. Howard's father, Claire's uncle, both gone in one day. And then the lawsuits, the families torn apart." "Mom," Jenny warned, but the older women were already deep in the story. "Howard's mother blamed Claire's father for the safety violations," Marie continued, "and Claire's family blamed Howard's father for ignoring the warning signs. By the time the truth came out that neither man was responsible, it was too late. The damage was done." The bell above the door chimed as Margaret Dawson from the hardware store hurried in. "Have you seen today's paper? Howard's got Claire's dog." "But they don't know it yet," Linda added. "Dr. Chen told me Howard brought the dog in, but the microchip registration was outdated." Down the street at Rose's diner, similar conversations were taking place. Rose herself kept quiet, wiping down tables with methodical strokes. But her mind was on that spring of '73. She remembered Howard and Claire sharing pie in her booth by the window, planning their future. She remembered the day of the factory accident, how the emergency sirens had shattered the peaceful afternoon. And she remembered the aftermath. 2 grieving families, 2 broken hearts, 2 lives veering off in different directions. The town had changed after the factory closed. The newspaper from that day still sat in Rose's bottom drawer. "Millbrook Valley factory disaster claims 2 lives. Investigation ongoing." The investigation had eventually cleared both men of wrongdoing, revealing instead a complex series of corporate decisions made far from Millbrook Valley. But by then, Howard had retreated into solitude, and Claire had left for college, never to return. Until now. Rose watched through her window as Howard walked past with Max, the dog trotting happily beside him. She noticed how Howard's rigid posture had softened slightly, how he actually nodded to people he passed, instead of avoiding eye contact. "You should tell them," her daughter Amy said, coming up beside her. "About the notices in the paper." Rose shook her head. "Some things need to find their own way, like water finding its path downhill, or wildflowers finding places to bloom." Amy smiled. "Mom, you've been waiting 40 years to see those 2 back together, not just me." Rose nodded toward the window, where several townspeople were watching Howard and Max with poorly concealed interest. "This whole town's been holding its breath, wondering if they'd ever get a second chance." Across town, in the local library, Claire sat at a computer searching local lost pet websites. She didn't notice the whispers behind the stacks, the knowing looks exchanged between long-time residents who recognized her. She didn't see the librarian, Mrs. Patterson, deliberately avoiding telling her about Howard's found dog notice, believing like Rose that some things needed to happen in their own time. And in his garden, Howard was teaching Max to respect the flower beds, unaware that Claire was less than a mile away. He'd added Walk Max to his daily planner in permanent ink, no longer pretending this was just a temporary arrangement. The sale town watched and waited, holding its collective breath. In shop windows, the found and lost notices faced each other across Main Street, like 2 halves of a story waiting to be rejoined. And in gardens all over Millbrook Valley, spring flowers were beginning to bloom, some in neat rows, others wherever the wind had carried their seeds. Howard stood at the edge of his garden, a forgotten cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The morning light revealed something he hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't allowed himself to see. His perfect rows, his carefully maintained borders, his methodically pruned shrubs. It all looked strangely lifeless, like a photograph of a garden rather than a living thing. Max sat beside him, watching a butterfly dance among the roses. The dog's presence had already begun changing the garden's rigid geometry. There was a slight depression under the oak tree where he liked to nap, scattered leaves he'd disturbed during his daily explorations, even a few paw prints in the newly turned earth near the fence. "What do you think, boy?" Howard asked, setting down his coffee. Time for some changes. He found himself walking to the garden shed, Max following with interest. Inside, past the meticulously organized tools, sat cardboard boxes he hadn't opened in 15 years. The first contained old garden journals, their pages filled with Claire's careful notations about companion planting and natural arrangements. "See this?" He showed Max a sketch Claire had made. "That's how gardens are supposed to grow, not like," he gestured at his current garden, "not like a military parade ground." The next box held packets of wildflower seeds, long expired but still hopeful. Beneath them lay Claire's old garden journal, its green cover faded but intact. Howard's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "April 15th, 1973, he read aloud to Max. "The magic of a garden isn't in controlling it, but in letting it surprise you, like love. The more you try to control it, the less real it becomes." Max's tail thumped against the shed floor. She was right, you know. Howard closed the journal, gently, about everything. That morning, for the first time in 15 years, Howard Mitchell didn't follow his garden maintenance schedule. Instead, he and Max walked the paths between the flower beds, really looking at each plant, each space. He found himself remembering Claire's lessons about letting nature guide the design. "These roses," he told Max, touching a perfectly pruned bush. "They're too constrained. Claire would say they need room to breathe, to reach for the sun in their own way." Working slowly, thoughtfully, Howard began loosening the rigid structure he'd imposed. He pulled up some of the border stones that divided the flower beds into geometric sections. He let his pruning grow softer, more natural. In one corner, he even scattered some of the expired wildflower seeds. They probably wouldn't grow, but the act itself felt important. A car passed by on the street, slowing slightly. Howard caught a glimpse of someone looking toward his garden, but for once, he didn't mind being observed. Let them look. Let them see that things could change. Max helped in his own way, digging an enthusiastic hole next to the fence. Instead of immediately filling it in, as he would have done just days ago, Howard found himself planting a climbing vine there. "Something to grow wild," he explained to Max. "Something unplanned." By afternoon, the garden looked less perfect, but more alive. Howard's back ached from the unaccustomed work, but it was a good ache. He sat on the bench beneath the oak tree, Max settling beside him, and looked at what they'd accomplished. The newly softened edges reminded him of the school garden where he'd first fallen in love with Claire. How she'd taught him that the most beautiful arrangements often came from letting plants find their own paths. How she'd laughed when he'd tried to plant everything in straight lines. "I forgot all that," he told Max. "Forgot that gardens are supposed to be alive, not just organized. Forgot that sometimes the best things grow in unexpected places." A breeze stirred the branches above them, sending dappled sunlight dancing across the garden. In the disturbed soil near the fence, a single wildflower seed, dormant for 15 years, felt the warmth of the sun and began ever so slowly to stir. Howard reached for his planner, intending to note the day's activities. Instead, he found himself drawing a small sketch in the margin, a climbing vine growing free and wild. It was a tiny act of rebellion against his self-imposed order, but it felt right. "What do you say we skip the evening pruning today?" he asked Max. "Let things grow as they will for a while." Max's response was to stretch out in a patch of sunshine, completely unconcerned with the schedule. Howard watched him, thinking how quickly this dog had become part of his life, how naturally he disrupted 15 years of careful routine. Like wildflower seeds scattered on the wind, some changes couldn't be planned. They just happened, finding their own way to bloom. The call came from Dr. Chen's office just as Howard was finishing his morning coffee. Max lay at his feet, having already adjusted to their new shared routine. "Mr. Mitchell, we've had someone respond to one of your posters," Jenny said. "They think they might have seen your dog's owner." Howard's hand tightened on the phone. After a week of caring for Max, the prospect of finding his owner brought unexpected anxiety. "What did they say?" "A woman matching the description from The microchip registration was seen at Rose's diner last week. They said she was asking about rental properties in the area. Last week, the same time Rose had mentioned seeing Claire. Howard's mind made the connection, but immediately dismissed it. Thompson was a common name, after all. The person who called, they said the woman had a garden journal with her. She was showing Rose some old pressed flowers. The coffee mug slipped from Howard's hand, shattering on the kitchen floor. Max jumped up, startled by the noise. "Mr. Mitchell, are you there?" "Yes," he managed. "Yes, I'm here. Did they leave a name?" "The woman's name?" "No, just that she's staying somewhere in town. They thought you might want to check with Rose." After hanging up, Howard stood motionless in his kitchen, coffee spreading across the floor around the broken mug. Max nudged his hand, concerned by his stillness. "It can't be," he told the dog. But even as he said it, pieces were falling into place. The outdated Cincinnati address, the Thompson name, the garden journal. In his study, Howard pulled out Claire's old journal, found again just yesterday. The pressed flowers between its pages suddenly seemed to hold new significance. If Claire was really here, if Max was really her dog, he sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the possibility. Max settled at his feet, offering silent support. The sound of a car slowing outside drew his attention. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of a silver sedan passing by his house, driving slowly as if looking for something. The driver was just a silhouette, but for a moment, his heart stopped. "Come on," he told Max, suddenly needing to move, to do something. "Let's go see Rose." The walk to the diner felt different today. Howard noticed every car that passed, every person on the street. Any of them could be Claire, could be connected. To her, the town he'd ignored for 15 years suddenly felt alive with possibility and danger. Rose was waiting behind the counter, as if she'd been expecting him. Her expression was unreadable as she watched him enter, Max trotting faithfully beside him. "Heard you got a call about the dog," she said without preamble. "Rose." Howard's voice was steady despite his racing heart. "The woman you saw last week. The one who ordered—" "Turkey Club, extra pickles," Rose finished. "Some habits don't change." Was it Claire? The question hung in the air between them. Rose took her time answering, wiping down an already clean section of counter. "You know," she said finally, "she asked about you too. Not directly, but she looked out at your garden through the window. Said something about straight lines never belonging in nature." Howard's legs felt weak. He grabbed the counter for support, and Max pressed against his legs, steadying him. "She's staying with Rachel," Rose continued. "Her sister. Lost her dog the day she moved back to town." She paused, looking meaningfully at Max. Golden Retriever, senior, very well-mannered. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Howard looked down at Max, who gazed back with those gentle brown eyes. How had he not seen it? The careful training, the gentle demeanor, the immediate trust, all hallmarks of a dog who'd been deeply loved. "Does she know?" he managed to ask. "About Max being with me?" Rose shook her head. "Some things need to find their own way. Like wildflowers," Howard finished softly. "She walks in Thompson Park every morning," Rose offered. "Early with a leash, still hoping." Howard nodded, his mind already racing ahead. Tomorrow morning. Thompson Park. The place where he and Claire had first met, where they'd planned their future, where everything had begun. "Thank you," he said, turning to leave. "Howard," Rose called after him, "sometimes the hardest gardens to tend are the ones we let go wild, but they're often the most worth saving." Outside, the spring air felt electric with possibility. Max seemed to sense his agitation, staying closer than usual as they walked home. Every step felt like movement towards something inevitable, terrifying, and wonderful. In his garden, the scattered wildflower seeds were still waiting to sprout. Tomorrow morning, he would walk to Thompson Park with Max. Tomorrow morning, after 40 years, he would see Claire again. Unless, like those seeds, some things needed more time to find their way back to life. The veterinary clinic's waiting room was busier than usual that morning. Howard sat with Max, who needed a routine checkup, At least that's what he'd told himself when making the appointment. In truth, he'd hoped Dr. Chen might have more information about Max's previous owner. "Your 10 o'clock is running late," Jenny told him from behind the reception desk. Dr. Chen had an emergency case come in. Howard nodded, absently stroking Max's head. The dog's ears suddenly perked up, his attention fixed on the door. A familiar perfume drifted through the air, something floral with hints of gardenia. The door chimed. "I'm so sorry I'm late," a voice said from the entrance. "Traffic on Main Street." Howard froze. That voice. Even after 40 years, he would know it anywhere. "No problem, Ms. Thompson," Jenny replied. "But Dr. Chen is still with another patient. Would you like to wait?" Time seemed to stop. Howard couldn't turn around, couldn't move. Max whined softly, pulling toward the door, but Howard held the leash tight. "Actually, I'll come back later," Claire said. "I just wanted to check if there were any reports of my dog." "Nothing new since yesterday," Jenny said sympathetically, "but we'll call if we hear anything." The door chimed again. The gardenia scent faded. Howard released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "She was here yesterday too," Jenny said quietly, "and the day before, looking for her dog." Max's tail had stopped wagging, his eyes fixed on the door where Claire had been. For a moment, Howard considered running after her, calling her name. Instead, he sat there, his heart pounding, wondering if she would have recognized him as easily as he'd recognized her voice. "Mr. Mitchell?" Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway. "We're ready for Max now." In the examination room, Howard barely heard Dr. Chen's updates about Max's excellent health. His mind was in the waiting room, replaying those few seconds when only a turned head had separated him from facing Claire. "Did you know," he finally asked Dr. Chen, "that Max belongs to Claire Thompson?" Dr. Chen's hands stilled on Max's coat. "I suspected, when she first came in describing her lost dog, but I couldn't be certain. And then you started bringing him in, and he was so happy, so settled. He recognized her voice," Howard said. "Just now, he knew she was there." "Dogs are loyal," Dr. Chen said carefully, "but they're also wise. Sometimes they know what we need before we do." Howard looked at Max, who gazed back with those understanding eyes. How many mornings had this dog watched him slowly come back to life? How many afternoons had they spent together in the garden, letting order give way to natural growth? "She's looking for him every day," Dr. Chen added. "Coming here, putting up posters, walking the neighborhoods." "I know," Howard's voice was barely audible. "Rose told me." "Then why haven't you—" "Because what if she hates me?" The words burst out before he could stop them. "What if she blames me for everything that happened? What if—" Max pressed. Against his leg, a warm, solid presence grounding him in the present. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Chen said gently, "in my experience, hate doesn't keep someone searching day after day. Hate doesn't make someone's voice shake when they talk about what they've lost." She handed him a prescription for Max's heartworm medication, then paused. "You know, sometimes the hardest step is just opening the door. The rest finds its own way." Outside, Howard and Max walked home slowly. Every passing car might be Claire's, every figure on the street might be her. The town felt smaller suddenly, as if 40 years of carefully maintained distance had collapsed into a few blocks of possibility. At home, Howard added the prescription receipt to Max's growing file of vet records. His hand brushed against the found dog posters he'd put up around town. Posters that might have brought Claire to his door any day in the past week, if she'd only seen them. Max brought him his leash, ready for their afternoon walk. But instead of their usual route, Howard found himself turning toward Thompson Park. Perhaps tomorrow he would have the courage to go early, to face what had been lost, and what might still be found. For now, he thought about Claire's voice, about Max's instant recognition, about all the paths that had led them here. Sometimes the longest journeys ended where they began, in a garden, in a park, in a moment of choice between turning around and walking away. The attic had remained untouched for 15 years. Howard stood at the pull-down ladder, flashlight in hand, Max watching curiously from below. After nearly encountering Claire at the vet's office, memories had surfaced that demanded attention, and he knew exactly where they were stored. "Stay," he told Max, though the dog seemed content to guard the ladder. The attic air was thick with dust and forgotten things. Howard's flashlight beam caught the corner where he'd stacked the boxes from his parents' house, the ones he'd never had the courage to open after the accident. He'd brought them here when he bought this house, carrying the weight of their contents. Like stones in his heart, the box he wanted was marked simply Dad. Inside, beneath his father's old work papers and factory documents, lay a cream-colored envelope, addressed but never sent. Claire Thompson, 247 Maple Street, Millbrook Valley. Howard's hands trembled as he opened it. The paper was brittle. With age, the ink faded, but still legible. "Dear Claire, by the time you read this, you'll have heard about the accident at the factory. About your Uncle Thomas, about my father, about how both our families are broken now. They're saying it was Dad's fault, that he ignored the safety warnings, that he pushed your uncle to keep the line running despite the risks. Your father is probably telling you this right now, and he has every right to be angry, but there's something you need to know, something I found in Dad's office tonight while Mom was at the hospital. There were letters, Claire, dozens of them. Dad and your uncle had been writing to corporate for months, begging for the safety upgrades. They were working together, trying to protect everyone. The real fault lies with men in distant offices who decided profit margins were worth more than safety measures. Men who'll never face the families they've destroyed. I wanted to tell you this in person, but your father won't let me near the house. Maybe he's right. Maybe our families are too tangled now in grief and blame to ever find our way back to each other. But I couldn't let you think your uncle died because of my father's negligence. They were friends, Claire, partners. They tried to prevent this. I love you. I think I always will. But love isn't always enough, is it? Sometimes life takes things we thought were permanent and shows us how fragile they really are. Take care of your garden. Let the wildflowers bloom where they will. And someday, if you think of me, remember that summer before everything changed, when we thought love really could conquer all. Forever yours, Howard." He sat heavily on an old trunk, the letter trembling in his hands. He'd never sent it, had convinced himself it was better to let Claire believe what everyone else believed, had watched her family move away, taking her light and laughter with them. Max's whine from below broke through his memories. Howard carefully folded the letter and climbed down the ladder. "I should have sent it," he told Max, who pressed against his leg in support. "Should have fought harder. Should have—" He trailed off, looking out his window toward town. Somewhere out there, Claire was still searching for Max, still walking the streets of Millbrook Valley with an empty leash and a heart full of misconceptions about the past. Howard looked at the letter again. The truth had waited 40 years. In his attic, gathering dust while two families lived with unnecessary pain. While he and Claire lived separate lives, divided by circumstances they'd never fully understood. Max brought his leash, tail wagging hopefully. "You're right," Howard said. "It's time." He tucked the letter into his jacket pocket and checked. His watch. Early evening. Claire would likely be at Rachel's house by now, the house he'd avoided walking past for 15 years. "Ready for a longer walk?" he asked Max. The dog's eager response felt like confirmation. Together, they stepped out into the golden evening light, leaving the safety of Howard's carefully ordered world behind. The letter in his pocket felt like both a burden and a key, a chance to finally unlock the door that had stayed closed for 40 years. But as they turned onto Maple Street, Howard saw a moving truck in front of Rachel's house. And there, directing the movers with boxes, was Claire herself. He stopped, frozen in place. She looked up, somehow sensing his presence. Their eyes met across 40 years of misunderstanding. Max's leash slipped from Howard's suddenly nerveless fingers. Max's leash had never felt heavier in Howard's hands as he made his way through the growing festival crowd. The annual Millbrook Valley Spring Festival had transformed Main Street into a maze of booths, strings of lights crisscrossing overhead. Despite the daylight, he hadn't attended in 15 years, but today something pulled him forward. The letter remained in his pocket, its edges softened from his constant touching. After their eyes had met outside Rachel's house yesterday, Claire had disappeared inside before he could speak. The moving truck had driven away, leaving him with questions about whether she was leaving again or simply moving her things to a more permanent location. Rose's booth sat at the heart of the festival, offering her famous apple pies and knowing looks to passers-by. She spotted Howard and Max approaching. "About time you showed up," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Claire's at the garden club booth. Been there all morning, helping with the plant sale." Howard's step faltered. "Rose! Oh, look who needs help with the lemonade," Rose interrupted, already turning away. "Jennifer, hold down the fort here, would you?" Before Howard could protest, Rose was steering him through the crowd, Max trotting happily beside them. The garden club booth came into view, its tables laden with potted herbs and flowering plants. And there, arranging a display of native wildflowers, stood Claire. She wore gardening gloves and a blue apron, her silver-streaked hair caught up in a casual knot. Time had been kind to her, softening rather than hardening her features. Or perhaps it was simply that she looked exactly as Howard had imagined. She would, as if his heart had aged her portrait perfectly over 40 years. "Those need more sun," he heard himself say. Claire's hands stilled on the wildflower display. She didn't turn around, but Howard saw her shoulders tense. "The black-eyed Susans," he continued, his voice gentler. "They're reaching for light, like they always did in the school garden, remember?" Now she did turn, her eyes finding his face, then dropping to Max, who was straining toward her with eager recognition. "Max?" Her voice broke on the name. The dog whined, tail wagging furiously. Howard released the leash and Max bounded forward, nearly knocking over a display in his excitement to reach Claire. "Oh, my sweet boy," she breathed, kneeling to embrace him. "Where have you been?" "With me," Howard said quietly. "He showed up at my door the morning after the storm." Claire looked up, really looking at him now, her hands buried in Max's fur. "Your door? The house at the edge of town, the one with the too orderly garden," she finished. "I drove past it. Never knew." Around them, the festival continued, but Howard barely noticed the crowd. Rose had mysteriously disappeared, though he suspected she wasn't far away. The letter pressed against his chest like a living thing. "Claire, Ms. Thompson." A young girl appeared with a question about herb prices. "I need to..." Claire gestured at the booth, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Of course." Howard stepped back, but Claire's hand shot out, catching his sleeve. "Please, don't go," she said quickly. "I'm done here in an hour. Could we talk?" "I'll wait," he promised. The hour passed in a blur of festival noise and movement. Howard found a bench nearby, Max lying contentedly at his feet, occasionally glancing between his two favorite people as if satisfied with his matchmaking. Festival goers stopped to admire the dog, to greet Howard with surprised pleasure at seeing him out and about, to comment on the perfect spring weather. He watched Claire work, noting how she touched each plant with gentle fingers, how she shared growing tips with customers, how her smile grew more natural as she relaxed into the familiar rhythm of talking about things that grow. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the busy space, and decades would collapse into seconds before someone needed her attention again. Finally, she was untying her apron, speaking quietly with her replacement. She walked toward Howard's bench, hesitating, just slightly before sitting beside him. Max immediately put his head in her lap, and she smiled, stroking his ears. "He looks happy, healthy. He's been good for me," Howard admitted. "Helped me remember some things I'd forgotten." "Like what?" "Like how gardens shouldn't be too orderly. Like how some things need to find their own way to grow." He took a breath, like how 40 years is too long to keep the truth buried. Claire's hands stilled in Max's fur. Around them, the festival lights were beginning to glow as dusk approached, casting a gentle glow over faces both strange and familiar. Music drifted from the bandstand, an old song they might have danced to once, in another lifetime. The old bench by Miller's Lake had weathered 40 years of seasons, its wood silvered with age, but still solid. Howard and Claire sat at opposite ends, Max stretched between them, his head in Claire's lap, his tail occasionally brushing Howard's knee. The festival lights twinkled in the distance, but here in the growing dusk they were alone with their memories. Claire held the letter with trembling hands, her eyes moving over the faded words. Howard watched her face, seeing echoes of the girl she'd been in the woman she'd become. The same slight furrow between her brows when she concentrated, the same gentle way she tucked her hair behind her ear. "All these years," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, I thought—" "I know." Howard's voice was rough with regret. "I should have fought harder to tell you. Should have found a way. Dad was so angry. He wouldn't listen to anything about your family. And then we moved away so suddenly." She stopped, taking a shaky breath. "I wrote to you 3 times. The letters came back unopened. I never got them. We moved too. Mom couldn't stand living in town after everything. I came back. When she died, bought the house at the edge of town, started growing things again. In straight lines," Claire said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "In straight lines," Howard agreed. "It was the only way I knew to keep control, to keep the past where I thought it belonged." Max shifted, sensing the emotion in there. Voices. Claire stroked his head absently, her eyes on the lake where they'd once planned their future. "I saw your garden last week," she said. "Driving past, it reminded me of that lesson you never quite learned, about letting things grow naturally. I'm learning now." Howard gestured to the letter. Max helped. Made me see how empty all that order was. Made me look in the attic, find that letter. Made me remember. Remember what? Everything, the school garden, this bench, the way you taught me about companion planting, which flowers grow better together, which ones need space to spread their roots. "Like people," Claire said softly. A night bird called across the lake. The festival music had changed to something slower, more nostalgic, carrying memories on its melody. "What happened to us, Howard?" Claire's question hung in the air between them. Really happened, beyond the accident, beyond the blame. "We let other people's anger become our story." Howard turned to face her fully. "We were so young, Claire. So sure we could fix everything with love, but when it got hard, when it got impossible," she corrected gently. "Was it impossible? Or did we just believe it was because everyone told us it had to be?" Claire looked down at the letter again. "Your father and my uncle, they were trying to prevent the accident. Together. They were friends, Claire, partners. The real villain was corporate greed, but that truth got lost in the grief, in the need to blame someone close, someone real." A tear slipped down Claire's cheek, catching the last light of sunset. Howard's hand moved instinctively to wipe it away, then stopped, uncertain. But Claire caught his hand, holding it against her face for a moment. "I married Robert," she said quietly. "He was kind, steady. We had a good life. But sometimes I'd be in our garden, and I'd hear your voice explaining about rose pruning, even though you'd learned it all from me." "I never married," Howard admitted. "Never found anyone who made gardens make sense the way you did." Max chose that moment to sit up, looking between them with what could only be described as canine exasperation at how long humans took to figure things out. Claire laughed, the sound startling them both with its warmth. "Look at us, sitting on the same bench where we first kissed, talking about gardens and grief, while this wonderful dog plays matchmaker." "He's good at it," Howard smiled. "Better than Rose, even." "Rose?" Claire's eyes widened. "Is that why she kept telling me to try the house at the edge of town for Max? That meddling matchmaker," Howard finished. "The whole town's been watching us dance around each other this past week." Like teenagers again, Claire said, but her voice was warm with affection rather than embarrassment. The darkness was complete now. The festival lights reflected in the lake's surface like earthbound stars. Howard felt Claire's hand find his again, their fingers intertwining with the ease of muscle memory. "We're not teenagers anymore," he said softly. "We've lived whole lives apart, learned different ways of being." "True." Claire squeezed his hand. "But maybe that's good. Maybe we needed those years to become people who could find each other again. People who understand that love isn't just passion and promises, it's choice and forgiveness, and learning to let gardens grow wild sometimes." Max barked softly, as if in agreement, and they both laughed. The sound rolled across the lake, joining. The festival music, the night birds, the whisper of leaves, all the voices of Millbrook Valley that had waited 40 years to hear that sound again. Back at Howard's house, the kitchen light cast a warm glow as he made coffee. Claire sat at the small table, Max at her feet, while Howard pulled a worn manila folder from his desk drawer. The label read simply, "Factory Report, Final Investigation." "I got this years later," he explained, setting 2 mugs down, "after both our parents were gone. Thought it wouldn't matter anymore, but I kept it anyway." Claire opened the folder carefully. Inside, official letterhead declared Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Investigation Findings. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to read. "The structural failure resulted from systematic neglect of maintenance protocols by Eastern Manufacturing Corporation," she read aloud. "Despite repeated requests for safety upgrades from local management," her voice caught. "From local management, Thomas Reed and James Mitchell. Our fathers," Howard said softly. "They'd been documenting everything, every request, every denial, every patch job they were forced to make. They knew it wasn't safe, but they kept the factory running. They had to. 300 families depended on those jobs. But they were trying to fix it, Claire, together. The real failure came from offices 1,000 miles away, from men who never set foot in Millbrook Valley." Claire turned a page, then stopped, drawing in a sharp breath. There, paperclip 2. A memo was a photograph. 2 men stood before the factory gates, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling. Her Uncle Thomas and Howard's father James, looking nothing like the bitter enemies their families had believed them to be. "When was this taken?" she asked. 3 days before the accident. They'd just filed another urgent request for repairs. Dad was sure this time they'd have to listen. Claire touched the photograph gently. "I remember that shirt Uncle Thomas is wearing. Aunt Helen gave it to him for Christmas." She looked up at Howard. "They were friends, really friends. Best. Friends. Had been since high school. That's why—" Howard took a deep breath. "That's why it hurt so much when everyone started throwing blame around. Dad couldn't even defend himself, couldn't tell your family the truth while he was in that coma. By the time he woke up, the stories had already taken root." Max whined softly, pressing against Claire's leg as tears began to fall. Howard wanted to reach for her, but wasn't sure if he should. They weren't teenagers anymore, with easy comfort and casual touches. But Claire made the decision for him, standing suddenly and moving to his side of the table. "Hold me," she whispered. "Please, just hold me." He stood, drawing her into his arms, feeling her tears soak into his shirt. They stood like that for a long time, while Max circled them anxiously, and the coffee grew cold. "I'm so sorry," Claire said finally, her voice muffled against his chest, "for believing the worst, for not fighting harder to know the truth." "We were all blind with grief," Howard said, "all looking for somewhere to put the pain." She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "But you knew, you found out, and you still didn't tell me. By then you had a life in Cincinnati, were married to Robert. What good would it have done to dig up old graves? It would have healed something in here." Claire pressed a hand to her heart. Something that never quite stopped aching. Howard understood. He'd carried the same ache for 40 years. They sat back down, but closer now, their shoulders touching. Max settled between them, head resting on Claire's foot. "Tell me about Robert," Howard said gently. "He must have been a good man." A soft smile touched Claire's lips. He was kind, patient, understood that part of my heart would always be here in Millbrook Valley. He even encouraged me to plant a garden like the one at school. She paused. He died last year, heart attack, very sudden. I'm sorry. He had a good life. We both did. But now, she turned to look at Howard, now I'm here, and you're here. And somehow this wonderful dog brought us back together. And I can't help thinking about what your letter said, about love not always being enough. I was wrong, Howard said quietly. Love is always enough. We just have to be brave enough to let it grow where and how it will, like wildflowers, they said together. And suddenly they were laughing through tears, while Max wagged his tail and the kitchen clock ticked away moments that no longer felt like time lost, but like seeds waiting for the right season to bloom. Morning light filtered through the kitchen window, catching the steam from fresh coffee cups. Howard and Claire sat at his small table, a notebook open between them, filled with Claire's careful sketches of garden plans. Max dozed nearby, content in having his two favorite people together. The roses need more space, Claire said, pencil moving across paper. And here, along the fence, we could plant climbing jasmine, create a natural boundary instead of such rigid lines. Howard watched her draw, mesmerized by the familiar way she caught her lower lip between her teeth when concentrating. We? He asked softly. Her pencil paused. I'm sorry. I shouldn't assume. No, he said quickly. I like we. Where are you staying? Rose mentioned you were at Rachel's, but then I saw the moving truck. Ah. Claire set down her pencil. I've rented the Peterson cottage, just past the library. It's small, but it has good light, and a garden that needs love. You're staying in Millbrook Valley? She met his eyes. I'm staying. After Robert, well, Cincinnati held too many memories, and when Max disappeared that first day here, it felt like a sign, like maybe it was time to come home. Howard reached across the table, covering her hand with his. The touch was still new enough to make them both pause, still wonderful enough to bring color to their cheeks. The garden can be our test, Claire suggested. See how we work together now, after all this time. I remember being a terrible student, Howard smiled, always wanting everything in straight lines. You weren't terrible, just particular. And maybe that's what we both need now, a balance between your order and my chaos. Max raised his head, hearing something they couldn't. Moments later, a knock at the door revealed Rose, holding a basket of fresh scones. Thought you might need breakfast, she said, not bothering to hide her pleased smile at finding them together. And these garden plans needed returning. She pulled out a weathered journal, Claire's old notes about the school garden. Where did you get that? Claire asked, amazed. Found it when we were cleaning out the old school greenhouse last spring. Kept it, thinking. Rose shrugged. Well, thinking it might be needed again someday. After Rose left, they pored over the old journal together. Claire's teenage handwriting detailed plans that had once seemed so important. Which flowers to plant for the spring dance, how to arrange the beds for maximum color all season. Look at this, Howard said, pointing to a sketch. Your design for our future garden, the one we talked about having someday. Claire leaned closer, their shoulders touching. I'd forgotten about that. See how the paths curve? No straight lines? Anywhere. It's beautiful. Howard turned to look at her, and not just the design. She met his gaze, and for a moment they were teenagers again, full of dreams and possibilities. But they were also who they'd become. Two people who had lived full lives, learned hard lessons, and found their way back to each other. Howard, Claire said carefully, I'd like to try again. Not to recapture what we were. We can't go back to that. But maybe we could grow something new. Something that takes the best of who we were and who we are. Like companion planting, he said, making her smile. Different flowers growing stronger together. Exactly. She turned her hand over beneath his, intertwining their fingers. But we take it slowly. Get to know each other again. Let it grow naturally. No straight lines? Well, maybe a few. for balance. Max got up and brought them his leash, tail wagging hopefully. "He needs a walk," Howard said. "Would you like to?" "I'd love to." They walked together through Howard's garden, pointing out changes they could make, possibilities they could explore. At the gate, Howard hesitated. "Which way?" Claire smiled, understanding the deeper question. "How about we try a new path, one neither of us has taken before?" They turned left instead of right, Max leading the way, while behind them the morning sun touched the garden, where order and wildness would soon merge into something entirely new, something that, like love itself, would be allowed to grow in its own time, in its own way. Howard stared at his daily planner, pen hovering over the familiar grid of hours. For the first time in 15 years, he was struggling to fill in the schedule. How did one plan for happiness? For spontaneous afternoon visits and impromptu garden consultations? "Still trying to organize time into neat boxes?" Claire asked, appearing at his study door with 2 cups of tea. Max followed, having easily adapted to splitting his time between Howard's house and Claire's cottage. Old habits, Howard admitted, accepting the tea. "Though someone keeps disrupting my carefully planned days. Guilty as charged." Claire perched on the edge of his desk, glancing at the planner. "You've left Wednesday afternoon empty. I thought maybe, if you're free, we could visit the garden center in Riverside. They have those heirloom rose varieties you mentioned." Claire's smile warmed the room. "I'd love that, though Rachel's been hinting that she expects us for dinner that evening. Says she needs to officially approve of you. After 40 years, sisters are protective, especially ones who helped pick up the pieces." Claire's voice held old pain, but also healing. "She wants to know you're really ready for this." "That we both are." Howard set down his pen. "And are we ready?" "I think," Claire chose her words carefully, "I think we're ready to try, to learn each other again. Speaking of which," she pulled out her phone, showing him a text. "My daughter Sarah wants to FaceTime tonight. Meet the man who's been taking care of Max and making her mother smile again." Howard felt a flutter of nervousness. "What have you told her about me? About us? The truth, that we were each other's first love, that time and tragedy pulled us apart, that sometimes life gives second chances, if we're brave enough to take them." From the garden came the sound of workers. Howard had finally hired help to remove some of the more rigid elements of his landscape design. Claire's influence was already visible in the newly curved paths and more natural groupings of plants. "It's not just Sarah," Claire continued. "There's my grandson Tommy, who's already excited about our garden plans. And your cousin Mary called yesterday, wanting to know if we'd attend her daughter's wedding together. The whole town's watching us," Howard observed, "holding their breath to see if this works." "Let them watch." Claire set down her tea and took his hand. "We're not kids anymore, Howard. We don't need anyone's approval but our own." Max barked suddenly, alerting them to a car pulling up outside. Through the window they saw Dr. Chen emerging from her vehicle, carrying what looked like dog supplies. "I brought Max's favorite treats," she called out as they met her at the door, "and some joint supplements, though honestly he seems younger these days. Having both of you together agrees with him." "With all of us," Claire said softly. After Dr. Chen left, they found themselves in the garden, Max lounging in his favorite spot under the oak tree. Howard watched Claire examining a rosebush, her expert hands gently turning leaves to check for health. "Move in with me," he said suddenly. Claire straightened, surprised. "What?" "Not right away, but soon. The cottage is nice, but this place, with some changes with your touch, it could be ours, really ours." "What about your schedules, your routines?" Howard smiled, pulling her close. "Haven't you noticed? They're already changing. Every time you walk through that gate, every time Max chooses which house to nap in, every time we lose track of hours. Just talking, I'm learning that some things are better left unscheduled." Claire's arms slipped around his waist. "Are you sure? It's a big step. I've spent 40 years being careful, being sure, being alone." He touched her cheek gently. Maybe it's time to be a little uncertain, to let life surprise us, like wildflowers, like wildflowers. Their kiss was soft, unhurried, full of promise. Max watched with apparent approval from his shady spot, while in the garden, old walls came down and new paths began to form. The garden had never looked more alive. 6 months after Claire had first spotted Max through Howard's gate, the rigid lines and careful borders had given way to a natural abundance that took Howard's breath away. Roses climbed freely over newly installed arches, wildflowers dotted the winding paths, and the air hummed with bees visiting the herb garden Claire had planted. "Perfect timing," Claire said, surveying their work. "Everything's blooming for the garden tour." Howard still couldn't quite believe he'd agreed to include their garden in the annual Millbrook Valley garden tour. But when Rose had suggested using it to raise funds for the local animal shelter, he'd found himself nodding yes. "They'll be here soon," he said, checking his watch out of habit, though these days it was more gesture than necessity. "Are you sure about this? Opening our space to the whole town?" Claire slipped her arm through his. "Our space was meant to be shared. Like love itself," Max barked from his viewing spot on the porch, announcing the arrival of their first guests. Rachel appeared through the gate, followed by Claire's daughter Sarah and grandson Tommy. Behind them came Dr. Chen and her family, Rose and her daughters, and a steady stream of townspeople. "Oh my," Rose breathed, taking in the transformation. "Now this is what a garden should be." Tommy ran to Max, who accepted the boy's enthusiastic greeting with grandfatherly patience. "Mum, look, the flowers aren't in lines anymore." Sarah walked the paths slowly, touching petals with gentle fingers. "It's like the school garden you used to tell me about," she said to Claire. "The one where you and Howard first fell in love." "Similar," Claire agreed, "but better, because this one grows from who we are now, not just who we were then." Howard found himself explaining their design choices to interested visitors, how certain plants complemented each other, how some areas were left deliberately wild, how structure and freedom could coexist in the same space. He realized he was using Claire's phrases, her gardening wisdom, mixed with his own understanding of order and care. "Remember when you couldn't tell a peony from a petunia?" Claire teased, overhearing him. "I had a good teacher." "Have a good teacher," he corrected, pulling her close. The afternoon light turned golden as people gathered on the new patio. Rose had brought pies naturally, and others had contributed to an impromptu celebration. Someone had even hung strings of lights in the trees, turning the garden into an enchanted space as dusk approached. "A toast," Rachel called out, raising her glass. "To second chances, to growing love, and to one very clever dog who knew exactly what he was doing when he chose this garden to get lost in." Max, curled up between Howard and Claire's chairs, thumped his tail against the flagstones. "You know," Dr. Chen mused, "in all my years of veterinary practice, I've never seen a dog quite so strategic in his matchmaking, or a town quite so invested in a romance," Howard added, to knowing laughter. "We had 40 years of waiting to make up for," Rose pointed out, "and some of us never lost hope that you two would find your way back to each other." As the evening deepened, Howard watched Claire showing Tommy how to plant a seedling in a small pot he could take home. Her silver hair caught the glow of the garden lights, and her laugh carried across the space they'd created together. Max dozed nearby, his mission thoroughly accomplished. "Penny for your thoughts," Claire said later, joining him by the rose arbor. "Just thinking about paths," he replied, "about how sometimes the longest way around is the right way home." She leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side, and about how love, like gardens, grows best when we let it follow its natural course. "Exactly." He kissed her temple softly, "though I still like a few straight lines. For balance." "For balance," she agreed. "And speaking of balance," she turned in his arms, eyes twinkling. "Rose tells me the gazebo in Thompson Park is still perfect for dancing under the stars." Howard took her hand, remembering other dances, other stars, but knowing that this moment, this love, was better for having been lost and found again. Like a garden coming back to life after a long winter, they had bloomed again in their own perfect time. 1 year later, the ring box sat open on Howard's bedside table, catching the early morning light. Inside, 2 simple gold bands waited for the day ahead. Howard touched them gently, remembering another ring box from 40 years ago, one that had never been opened, never been given. "Max approves of the rings," Claire called from the garden. "He's been watching me hide them for weeks." Howard smiled, joining them outside. The garden was in full spring bloom, ready for today's celebration. White chairs lined the curved paths, and an arch of climbing roses marked the spot where, in a few hours, they would say the vows that had waited 40 years to be spoken. Max, grey around the muzzle now but still dignified, wore a new blue bow tie for the occasion. He'd taken his role as ring-bearer very seriously during yesterday's rehearsal, padding down the garden path with perfect timing. "Having second thoughts about the guest list?" Claire asked, noting Howard's thoughtful expression. They'd invited the whole town. How could they not, when every person in Millbrook Valley had played some part in bringing them back together? "Not at all," Howard assured her. "Just remembering something Rose said last year, about some things being worth the wait." Claire stepped into his arms, her gardening apron dusting soil onto his shirt. Neither of them minded. "We needed the time," she said softly, "needed to become people who could love better, deeper, who could understand that perfection isn't about straight lines or careful plans. Though a few straight lines never hurt," Howard teased, making her laugh. They had found their balance over the past year. The garden showed it best. Areas of thoughtful structure mixed with wild, natural growth. Like their love, it had matured into something that honored both order and chaos, planning and surprise. The sound of cars arriving broke their moment. Sarah and Tommy were first, followed by Rachel carrying the wedding cake. Rose appeared with fresh flowers for the tables, and Dr. Chen arrived with her family, Max's medical records tucked into a card envelope as her particular wedding gift. "Dad," Sarah called out, "the arch is perfect, and Mom, wait until you see what Tommy made for the guest book table." Tommy proudly displayed a carefully pressed flower arrangement. His first attempt at the art Claire had been teaching him. "Look, Grandma Claire, I used flowers from both gardens." Watching her grandson arrange his creation on the welcome table, Claire squeezed Howard's hand. Their families had blended as naturally as the flowers in their gardens, growing new connections, while honoring old roots. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Howard found himself standing before the mirror, adjusting his tie, straight this time, no need for Claire to fix it. Max sat beside him, the ring box secured in a special pocket of his bow tie. "Ready, old friend?" Howard asked. Max's tail thumped against the floor in answer. The ceremony itself was simple, perfect. Claire walked down the garden path on Rachel's arm, wearing a dress the color of spring leaves and carrying a bouquet of roses from their combined gardens. Max performed his ring-bearer duties flawlessly, earning treats from both Sarah and Tommy afterward. When it came time for the vows, Howard and Claire had chosen to speak from the heart rather than from written words. 40 years ago, Howard began, I tried to put love in straight lines, to make it follow careful plans. Today, I promise to let our love grow wild and free, guided by joy rather than rules. And I promise, Claire continued, tears shining in her eyes, to blend my wildflowers with your ordered rose, to create something more beautiful together than either of us could grow alone. As they spoke their promises, a butterfly landed on one of the roses arching above them. The townspeople seated in the garden, their witnesses, their supporters, their friends, smiled at the perfect timing of nature's blessing. Later, as evening fell and garden lights twinkled overhead, Howard and Claire swayed together on the dance floor they'd created between the flower beds. Max dozed nearby, worn out from accepting congratulations and treats from every guest. "Happy?" Howard asked. His wife, Claire's answer was to kiss him softly. Around them, their garden bloomed in the gathering dusk, roses and wildflowers, straight paths and winding ones, all growing together in the space they'd created for love to flourish. Some things, like gardens and love, take time to reach their full potential, but with patience, care, and the courage to let beauty find its own way to bloom, even the longest-waited dreams can come true in their own perfect season.